Thank you very much. I'll try to intersperse what I have written, which I don't think I'll be able to get through. It's too long. But with comments that might preview what I would have said if I had more time. From almost every conceivable angle and vision, the Hebrew scriptures and key passages of rabbinic thought in its legal and homiletical guises are about the pervasiveness of the metaphysical middle in human beings' perception and engagement of the world. Talking about the concept of a person, to me the first thought association that occurred when I was informed of the title I was supposed to write about, and as I began working on it, is the sense of life that is communicated by classic Jewish texts, the biblical text and rabbinic texts that follow, philosophical texts within the Jewish tradition outside of it. And the sense of life that is communicated by these classic texts has, I think, a great deal to do in sort of the collective unconscious of Judaism, if nowhere else, but I think also more explicitly and self-consciously in the self-images that Jews have cultivated and have transmitted across the generations. So I'll be talking primarily, in the time allotted to me, about biblical texts, but it's the sense of life that they communicate, which have formed the consciousness of generations of Jews from very early times down to the present, and that still have a large-scale impact in Jewish self-acknowledgement and self-understanding that I want to use as the major vehicle, as an inlet for comprehending the concept of the person in Judaism. The Bible does not envision either a firm beginning or a firm end to human life. Its major energies are devoted to projecting and sustaining the middle and to ensuring that this overall activity becomes the dominant focus of human lives. The biblical and rabbinic emphasis on the middle creates very large space for viewing human beings in general and Jews in particular as harboring the potential for exercising tremendous freedom and responsibility in shaping, structuring, and assessing our lives. In many key respects, the understanding of God and the images of human nature are correlative in Jewish religion. One achieves the deepest and most secure understanding of the concept of a person, the nature of human nature, by probing and exploring the concept of God. I mean, and the rabbis, very classically in the Talmud, draw a connection, which typically for them, typically for Jewish, modes of collective consciousness in general, is grounded in a verse in the Bible, in the Torah. And the verse is in Hebrew, "V'halachta b'drachav," walking in the ways of God. So the famous rabbinical exegesis of that is just like God is imputed to be compassionate, merciful, and so on, all these virtues of other regardedness, of taking the other always into account and looking to improve the life of the other. So we should follow in his ways. But I think the rabbis generalize this. That v'halachta b'drachav also includes the mandate, walking in the ways of God includes the mandate to the limitations that are associated with the consciousness and sensibility of God. How we describe God in many ways is evocative and deeply reflective of our limitations. There's a mirror image of ourselves in how the biblical text and the rabbinic commentaries upon it, how they portray God is really a sort of extended picture, or the initial picture, and we're the extension of how we need to view ourselves and how others need to view us. So the depictions of what is knowable about God and what is unknowable about God transfers in a myriad of overt and subtle ways to what is knowable and what is unknowable about the human person. I mean, our blind spots, our areas of imperviousness are all sort of inferable from the classic descriptions in the biblical texts and in their commentaries about the limitations that we as human beings have in relation to God. What we can know and not know about Him is also translatable to what we can know and not know about ourselves. In terms of the Hebrew Scripture's conception of human nature, I think that the Bible communicates its teaching to us in an important sense by establishing paradigms of emulation, such as Adam, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses, and fixing paradigms of avoidance, such as Pharaoh, Korah, Nadav and Abihu, one of the sons of Aaron, and the spies that Moses sent from the desert to scout out the land of Israel. In the first section of this paper, I would like to analyze biblical and religious sensibility, especially as it relates to the formation of human personality. In the second section, I'll make allusions to it in the first section, I'd like to theorize the implications of Maimonides' conceptualization of God in his laws concerning the foundations of the Torah, which is the first section of the Mishnah Torah, his code of Jewish law, which overlaps and is basically continuous. There aren't sharp discordances between his philosophical analysis of God in the first section of the Mishnah Torah and his discussion throughout the book, The Guide and the Perplexed. Generally, scholars have a field day in working with the tensions between these two texts. But one place where there is no tension is in the first section of his code and the guide as a whole. Maimonides' theorizing of God can be seen as serving as a fitting complement to the metaphysical sensibilities suffusing the biblical text itself. Perhaps an ideal context from which to observe Jewish understandings of human nature is to consider how Jewish sources approach the project of periodically remaking ourselves, or some unsatisfactory aspect of self, encapsulated in the concept of teshuvah. So another major source of enlightenment about how Jews conceive of the person is the space they allot and the arguments that they invoke, the rabbinical authorities and scholars and commentators, to dealing with the concept of repentance. I mean, the remaking of the self is the making of the self. It's where the self is at any given moment in its life. And so whatever insights are elaborated upon in discussions of teshuvah, of repentance, are basically central insights about the Jewish conception of the formation and character of human nature. And finally, one needs to also consider, which is a section of this paper I can only allude to in my current presentation, I'd like to briefly consider the question of how classic Jewish texts envision an end to history. Is there an end to human history? I mean, one of the remarkable things about Judaism, I think, is that it's not clear that Judaism envisions an end to human history. I mean, Judaism might say with Aristotle, this goes on forever. I mean, it's entirely possible that it's not heterodox to believe that our life on earth is a perpetual existence. I mean, the basic text that undergirds this is Maimonides, at the conclusion of his Mishnah Torah, his code, talks about how there is a generation of human living that succeeds the Messianic age. The Messianic age, the famous American baseball player, Yogi Berra, said that it ain't over till it's over. Well, I mean, according to Maimonides, it ain't ever over. I mean, if after King Messiah has appeared, is coronated, and the world has been elevated to a very high level, he dies. He dies a natural human death. He's an ordinary human being. No one transcends the human in Judaism, including King Messiah at the very end, quote unquote, of human history. And he's succeeded by something that Maimonides doesn't even bother to define. I mean, he acknowledges his ignorance. He is determinedly ignorant, in other words. It would be anti-Jewish to know at that point, so you just have to remain silent. Silence is a reverential religious gesture in many ways for Maimonides and for many key Jewish thinkers and non-Jewish thinkers. So you're silent, about which you're not allowed to speak, and you cannot speak, you're ignorant. But as an article of faith, Judaism is supposed to regulate life, so presupposition of the continuation of Judaism is the perpetuation of life. The mandate in the book of Deuteronomy, "Ubacharta b'chaim," and choose life. So if you're choosing life, you have to choose a messianic vision that tacitly affirms the ineradicable character of human life. And that also, in political terms, puts the spotlight on the achievement of peace. If life is supposed to go on indefinitely, and there's a post-Messianic age that can be religiously ordained from the perspective of the canons of Judaism, then the primacy of the achievement of international peace becomes even more reinforced than it is in the more secular and perhaps other religious auspices. In Judaism, life is a presupposition of the whole religious enterprise. So you need life there in order to have a religion. You need life there, you need peace there to have life. So the primacy of peace is given a special urgency, a special a spotlight is being focused on it as a precondition for the very existence of the religion itself. A distinction between negative theology and Gnosticism animates some of the most arresting passages in the biblical text. So just as a provisional, categorical dichotomy, I want to invoke negative theology and Gnosticism, and how the Bible this contains profound and continuing implications for human nature, how the Bible is very much on the side of negative theology and is very radically and profoundly an anti-Gnostic text. For example, the biblical negative theology is what is definitive of Maimonides. He's its most influential and famous popularizer in the history of Western thought. But it's very shocking to contemplate what his antecedents are. I mean, the most direct antecedent that I could find is actually a great Platonic dialogue called Parmenides. Parmenides is the most terse, I think, and the sharpest formulation of the tenets of negative theology. I mean, it's Maimonides reduced to a Platonic dialogue. Plato very incisively says in the Parmenides, the one can't even be one, the one with a capital O. In other words, God can't even be God if you're going to apply all of the negative theological strictures, then you can't even talk about God. To invoke the name of God is an act of sacrilege. It means you can't know it. You can't, it's all the infinite distance and the infinite character of God prevents you from being able to honor his name. The Maimonidean motto that most people who read the guide carefully are aware of comes from a verse in the Psalms, L'cha dumiyat tehillah, to use silence as praise. Being able to recognize that you cannot speak is the highest act of reverence that you can engage in relation to the biblical God. So in other words, what about all the 613 commandments? The 613 commandments are in a sense from Maimonides, and anyone who subscribes to the biblical, I'm going to argue, negative theology, is after the fact. The silence is the only gesture that'll work. If you realize that our limits are so built into our makeup, we're so wired metaphysically, theoretically, rationally, to adjust ourselves to these limits, that in the end what it does is prevent us from engaging in the religious acts that Judaism assigns primacy to. Now, so to assume that God exists is already to be invalidating him. It's a leap that the very tenets of who he is prevents you or preempts you from acknowledging. So to be religious is going against the religion. I mean, that paradox has to be intelligible to us in order for us to be proper Jews. If you think that you can, this distinction between theory and ideology is so much more important than most people realize. I mean, the religion that most of us practice is ideologically suffused and ideologically encumbered and ideologically distorted. If you want to, be a practicing monotheist with a theoretical understanding of what you're practicing, you realize the huge gaps that exist between what the religion requires you to do and what the theory that undergirds religion allows you to acknowledge you can engage in. There's a huge gap between what's required and what's practically required and what is theoretically permissible and allowable. And living with that tension is part of what it means to live as a monotheist. You have to realize that there's a taint of illegitimacy that adheres in the very practice of the religion. Practicing the religion doesn't make you better than anybody else. It doesn't make you inferior either, hopefully, but it doesn't make you better. It means you're living a certain life that cannot be fully governed either by revelation or tradition or anything. It's sui generis, and it's not fully coherent, and it's not fully justifiable. And the people who make that case the best are the people who represent the tradition. I mean, Maimonides is probably the most outstanding representative of Jewish tradition in the whole sweep of its history. And he makes the case better than anybody else that to be a practicing Jew is an illegitimate vocation. In many ways, you can't support it. But he has his whole Mishnah Torah is about what it means to live as a practicing Jew. But that gap is what makes him Jewish. I mean, that's what enables him to be the great, eloquent spokesperson that he is about the nature of the religion that he's writing about. For example, the biblical descriptions of Moses' confrontations with his Jewish archenemy, Korah, and his non-Jewish archenemy, Amalek, receive heightened point and poignancy when viewed from the perspective of this distinction, the negative theology, Gnosticism distinction. In addition, our understanding of such central biblical events as the theological transgression of the Dor HaFlaga, the Dor HaFlaga, the generation that built the Tower of Babel, the theological distinctness of the post-expulsion from the Garden of Eden stage of human life in relation to the pre-expulsion stage, the significance of the biblical accounts of creation and prophecy, the transgression involved in fashioning the golden calf, the transgressions of Nadav and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, and the spies, as well as a number of striking metaphors in the biblical narrative, such as Jacob's ladder and the burning bush, is enhanced by invoking the categorical contrast between Gnosticism and negative theology. So now I'd like to explore some of this. I'd like to focus first on the Bible's description of Moses, in contrast to the way it characterizes his arch-enemy Korah, who leads a religious. Korah's rebellion is the first Protestant rebellion in recorded history. He speaks in the accents of Luther and Calvin, and they learned how to speak from him. Who leads a religious and political rebellion against him, recounted in the book of Numbers. Moses is called in the biblical account an Eved Hashem, a servant of God. Eved is the term used in the Bible to describe a servile status of the Jews in Egypt. Moses is resolutely not deified in the biblical account of the Exodus, which pays close attention to the intra-family tensions and rivalries between Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, and the vagaries of class position, Moses' adoption by Pharaoh's daughter, in charting his rise to religious and political prominence. The Bible very squarely situates Moses as being in the throes of what Harold Bloom, following Freud, has called a family romance. The family romance is firmly ensconced in the biblical text, which reaches a climax in the book of Numbers. There, Miriam and Aaron speak against Moses because of the Cushite woman, his wife Zipporah, he had taken. The fact that he wasn't living with her anymore, he separated himself from her when he came close to God. The Bible very pointedly juxtaposes to their rebuke of Moses the statement that Moses was very humble above all the men who are upon the face of the earth. Moses feels powerless to speak out against it. As the parent-favored and sibling resented youngest child, his preferred medium of communication is action. As probably speaking, he stutters, so that reinforces this tendency. Picking up the cues and signals of opportunity, in a Machiavellian sense, earlier than other people, and responding to them more swiftly. There is an eerie congruence between the physical oppression of the Jewish people as a whole and the psychological oppression of Moses, with the configuration of Moses' oppression encoding for him a strategic way out, which he's able to apply to relieve the condition of the people as a whole. I mean, the Bible, the structure of biblical narrative is immensely complex and subtle. This, I think, is one of the generally missed subtleties, is that the discussion of the intra-family dynamics of Moses' family is intimately connected, has very deep repercussions on his, and how he liberates the Jews out of Egypt. The humanizing of Moses, which is symptomatic of the biblical account of his career, is perceived by the rabbis as a disguised theological statement. The rabbis read the biblical text as burning the most plausible bridge between humanity and God, namely Moses, in order to underscore that the distance between us and God remains unbridgeable. In the Passover Haggadah's recounting of the Exodus story, compiled by later generations of rabbis, Moses is nearly omitted altogether. He's conspicuous by his absence. So that the inscrutability of the divine role in redemption is not marred by any overly intrusive human presence. Moses' personification of a negative theological stance in relation to God receives classic expression in the subversive reading that Rashi, who's a major medieval Jewish commentator, both on the text of the Torah and on the text of the Babylonian Talmud, that he provides for famous Talmudic texts in Yevamot. The text reads as follows in English translation. All the prophets looked into a dim glass, and talking about God and to God, but Moses looked through a clear glass. The Hebrew-Aramaic version of this is that Moses saw aspaklaria ha'meira. Aspaklaria is a work of Greek etymological origin. It connects with the English word perspective and so on, a whole host of other interrelated English words. So Moses saw with a clear aspaklaria, clear perspective, a clear vision. In contrast to all the other prophets, which includes the names that we're all familiar with, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, every prophet under the sun, they saw aspaklaria she'einena meira, through a glass, a mode of perception, a perspective that was murky, that never achieved the degree of clarity that Moses achieved in his relationship with God. Now, as a commentary on this, you'd expect Rashi, who often cites biblical antecedents for Talmudic formulation, for rabbinic formulation generally, to point to a verse in the Torah that says, Peh el peh damar bot. I spoke to Moses mouth to mouth. Mouth to mouth, that's clear perception. So Rashi turns that on his head. This is one of the most astounding Rashis that I've ever come across. This is what Rashi says. Rashi voices the statement that Moses saw aspaklaria ha'meira, with a clear perspective, a clear vision, by saying that the other prophets thought they had seen, but hadn't. When Isaiah and Jeremiah think that they're in direct contact with God, they're under some kind of illusion. Whereas Moses saw through a clear glass and knew that he hadn't seen him face to face. His clarity was a Socratic clarity, a clarity of ignorance. He knew that he hadn't seen him. So, in other words, he was never beguiled by his own passionate transports to draw closer to God, to think that he saw him. So what do you do with a literal biblical text? You do what you do with all other literal texts in most other settings. You metaphorize them. You give them ingenious interpretive readings that enable you to have a clear passage out of the untenable literal transcription or translation into a more sustainable, theologically sustainable, and philosophically sustainable, unliteral, deliteralized translation. So in other words, the metaphoric translation is clarity, but it's Socratic clarity. It's not the clarity of direct vision. It's the clarity of rationally interposed reading. When your mind sifts through the text and reorders it so that your intellectual categories and modes of analysis can fit more nimbly, that's the text that you're reading. In other words, that's the clarity. The clarity is a kind of Greek clarity. It's not a literal Jewish clarity. The biblical prototype for a Gnostic believer is Korah. He rebels against the structure of authority instituted by Moses in the desert by saying to Moses and Aaron, "You take too much upon you, for all the congregation are holy." That's the Protestant feature there. Get rid of the church. We have this congregation of believers. So the first person to make that case overtly, very explicitly, hard to reinterpret it, to wrench it out of context, is Korach. The whole congregation is holy. Every one of them. And the eternal is among them. Why then lift yourselves above the assembly of the eternal? So the Hebrew phrase, Ubitocham Hashem, is ambiguous. The word toch in Hebrew can be translated, as the translation I've just cited suggests, as among, and toch can also be translated as inside, so that the phrase would now read, and the eternal is inside them. While I think the theological import of the passage remains the same, the Gnostic thrust of Korach's rebellion against Moses is most graphically communicated by the word inside. God is not outside the community of believers, so that you need a stable and legitimate structure of authority to transmit and enforce his messages. He is rather inside the psyches, if not the bodies, of believers, so that patterns of interaction can be more anarchic and spontaneous. Moses, by contrast, serves as the personification of a negative theological set of understandings. The idea of negative theology, that we can only say what God is not, he's not any of those things that we might think he literally is, to him contains an implied legitimation for rabbinic authority. In other words, since we don't know who God is, we need intermediaries. So the rabbis are the officially chartered, tutored, and prepared intermediaries. The voluntarism encoded in negative theology is through our assertions of will that God emerges as an object of worship and all, sanctions for Moses the institution of a collectively ordered response to God's role in the world through the introduction of systems of authority and hierarchy. From further biblical exemplifications of the negative theology versus Gnosticism typology would include the following. Through a rabbinic prism, there is an interconnected invocation of how the expulsion from Eden and the Tower of Babel incidents in the Bible gesture towards Gnosticism. This is, here I'm helped by conjoining together Rashi and Maimonides. There are many more cases of one supporting the other. I mean, there are actually scholars who work on this question. I mean, Rashi lived before Maimonides. So it is, and the modes of carrying teachings from one part of Europe to another were sufficiently developed for Rashi living in Troyes and Maimonides living in the Islamic and the Sephardic world. For one to have received the notifications of the teachings of the other, or some kind of sampling or edited versions, if not the full texts. And so it could be that some of what we associate as Maimonides' radicalism is to some extent Rashi's radicalism. I mean, that he picks it up from his illustrious older contemporary, and he runs with it, to the end zone. So, according to Maimonides, in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve had the capacity to discern truth from falsehood. So, what Adam and Eve had that they lost when they were expelled from Eden as a result of their act of disobedience against God's word was the capacity to know with finality how to distinguish truth from falsehood. And what they were left with, according to Maimonides, is that the categories, the dichotomy that they'd have to work with, having been debarred from being able to use truth and falsehood, they couldn't manipulate those terms in an appropriate way anymore. They couldn't comprehend them and utilize them in ways that would illuminate the context of events and texts that they were talking about. The words fine and bad. So this is an astounding formulation by Maimonides. I mean, what he's saying is ethics, the whole category, the whole field of knowledge called ethics, is symptomatic, is constitutive of human fallenness. It's because we didn't make the grade that we have to. God, Rahman al-Aslan, God protect us, that we have to resort to ethics. Ethics is a matter of imprecision, is a matter of gut feelings, of intuitions. It's not a matter of knowing the finality of anything. Ethics is you have to figure it out. And so you use whatever is available to come up with arguments to support one view on a particular case rather than another. So it's an indication of the fact that we don't make the grade of achieving an acceptable level of certainty. So we are reduced to ethical calculations, ethical arguments. It's a function of the fact that we are diminished. We are diminished as human beings. If we were fully accredited human beings, epistemology would have been enough. We can distinguish between truth and falsehood. It would preempt the whole field of ethics. Because, once something is true or false, it is intrinsically, from a Maimonidean perspective, from a Greek perspective, it's intrinsically coercive. Then if it's true, you got to do it. It's true, that's it. There's nothing more to be said. And if it's false, then you can't do it. You wouldn't need good and bad. You'd have true and false. It would preempt the need for ethics. Ethics would not emerge if Adam and Eve managed to stay where they were. Whatever comes under the categories of truth and falsehood would be intrinsically coercive and would not require or perhaps even allow for the interposition of separate assertions of human judgment to make particular courses of action binding upon individuals. The self-imposed mission of the tower builders was to recoup this privileged state of divine knowledge, of knowing exactly what was true and false for human beings. So the subterranean drive motivating the builders of the tower, Michael Oakeshott has written very perceptively, very subtly. He has, in the course of his very long career, he has 3 essays on the Tower of Babel, but none of them makes this point. Rashi made it well before him, and Maimonides fleshes it out in a classic manner. The idea that what they were after was, Oakeshott was very much concerned with the pursuit of certainty and the impossibility of ever getting there. And so the classic biblical text that supports this dominant Oakeshottian sentiment is exactly the text that fascinated him the most in the biblical canon, namely in the Tower of Babel. He didn't realize that his philosophy was there. It was in the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel, that's what they wanted. These were the Oakeshottian anti-heroes, the people that were characteristic of modernity that he was most suspicious of, were those who couldn't live within the precincts of uncertainty and required hard and fast truth on all occasions. So that's what the Tower of Babel is about. We're going to make it to heaven in order to have hard and fast truths. We want to recoup the Edenic state. We don't want to live east of Eden anymore. East of Eden is for throwaways. We want to be in God's presence. We want to know exactly what's true and what's false. And so, so that is the biblical text that basically condemns the pursuit of certainty as being integral to monotheistic sensibility. So the theory of Judaism, and this can be applied, I leave it to the experts who are going to be talking afterward, that presumably it's reflected in the theologies of Christianity and Islam. I have my own thoughts about how it's reflected there, but I'm not going to speak about them now. So in any event, the rejection of certainty is integral to monotheistic sensibility. The infinite God means that you can't know the truth with absolute clarity and definiteness. It's always going to be approximative. It's always going to be roundabout. It's going to be indirect. And so you can never close the gap. To be a monotheist is to acknowledge deep down in your consciousness that you can't close the gap. Only God knows the truth. He's the infinite being. And we engage in efforts that, according to Jewish tradition, go on eternally. The efforts never end. It's just a succession of mobilizations of human intellectual and physical energy to try and come up with new ways of closing the gap. With the article of faith that undergirds this, one of the major articles of faith, is that I'm never going to close the gap. But this is going to be the major effort of my life, is to close the gap. So human life is predicated upon impossibility. The necessary impossibility of living is reflected as the key presupposition of monotheistic religion. It's an impossible necessity. We can never meet it, but we can never relinquish it. And that's that's I think the presuppositional article of faith of Judaism. This is negative theology magnified. The book of Genesis in the Bible, which according to its title is supposed to begin by recounting the creation of the world, does no such thing. I mean, this has been the subject of tons of commentary across the centuries and even the millennia. Genesis, the word Genesis means origins, beginnings. If you look at the beginning of Genesis, there's no story of Genesis. In the first instance, the grammar of the first 3 verses of Genesis belies this sort of content. The first 2 sentences of the Bible are sentential fragments, which form the background to the third sentence, which does constitute a bona fide sentence containing a proper subject and predicate. It is as if the Bible wanted to alert us that it is not beginning at the beginning, but rather in medias res, inserting itself into a narrative that was begun elsewhere. This impression is reinforced by various midrashic statements. The rabbis say that prior to the creation of the currently existing world, God had created multiple worlds and destroyed them, until he finally created this one and let it stand until the flood. The rabbis also say that Shamayim, the Hebrew word for heavens, which God officially created on the second day, is a composite word consisting of the 2 words Aish, which means fire in Hebrew, and Mayim, which means water in Hebrew. But nowhere in the Genesis narrative of creation is there a listing of the fashioning of fire and water. Genesis appears to be inserting us in the middle of a pre-existing account of creation. So Genesis begins at the middle. If you want to talk about Jewish concept of personhood, that's it. The first 3 verses of the Bible tell you the whole story. Jewish concept of personhood, just like God was in the middle. The first glimpse of God that we get in Torah is of God in the middle. He's been working on this. Who knows how? He went back to the drawing board 1,000,000 times until he finally created a world that was unsatisfactory and remained unsatisfactory even if he abandoned it. That's the image of God. That's the original, the first image of God projected in the biblical text. Human beings, human beings can only aspire to be like God. We create imperfect things. And we inhabit an imperfect world. And we work to perfect it, but we never fully will. But we work at it. It's unending and it goes on forever, almost literally. That's the image. We are all workers, all constantly doing things. It's a very sober image. You know, it's not pessimistic. You know, it gives us work to do till the end of time, literally. So it's not pessimistic. But it's not optimistic either. You know, human beings are in the middle, even in that sense, in terms of our attitude toward ourselves and toward our collective human project. We're not excessively hopeful, we're not excessively pessimistic. We'll make it better, we'll make it worse, and we'll keep on doing this all along the way. And that's it. You know, that's our condition. And anyone who tells us that there's a cheaper way or faster way to do this is working for Madison Avenue. You know, is a public relations expert who has not really studied the biblical text and its commentaries. The theme of the paramountcy of the middle seems to be picked up again in what the Bible has to tell us about the lives of Adam and Eve. According to rabbinic tradition, Adam and Eve are buried alongside the patriarchs and matriarchs, Adam and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah, in the sacred site of Ma'arat HaMachpelah in Bethlehem. The question that immediately presents itself is, what are the special attributes that evoke this type of extraordinary recognition for Adam and Eve? Aside from being the first man and the first woman in the biblical account of creation, in what other unique ways do they impress themselves upon us? Abraham, for example, is identified with the virtue of kindness in terms of generosity to guests, among other behavioral manifestations. Aside from chronology, what else do Adam and Eve have to recommend them? Why are they residing in this eternal place of rest in Bethlehem? What do they offer us? What do they do for us, for humankind in general, across the generations? Optimal behavior do they model for us that we can learn from them across time, how to be better human beings? So I once heard a talk, I haven't seen this in writing, from someone by the name of Gordon Tucker, who's a recognized scholar. Gordon Tucker has suggested that what Adam and Eve embody is the centrality of new beginnings in terms of how we design and manage our lives. After being created by God, Adam and Eve are placed in the most privileged and exalted of locations, the Garden of Eden. After disobeying God's prohibition against eating from the tree of knowledge, they are thrust east of Eden, never to return in their lifetimes. Once they become regular denizens of planet Earth, they have twin sons, Cain and Abel, one of whom out of jealousy rises up and slaughters the other. Finally, in their third attempt to re-inaugurate their lives, with the birth of Seth, they succeed. By now, they're in the vicinity of like 600 to 700 years. The story of Adam and Eve is fully in sync. It re-encodes on a human level the story of God. God, as it were, required multiple attempts to fashion an imperfect world. And Adam and Eve required multiple attempts to efficiently and successfully live in one. Hannah Arendt in The Human Condition explores the etymological background in the Greek and Latin languages to the English verb to act, and discovers that it resides in the notion to begin. To act means to seek out and to engage in new beginnings. Without any guarantee of reaching a safe or stable destination, we human beings have the courage and the stamina and the equilibrium to begin again and again. Re-establishing new beginnings restores us to some metaphysical middle, when the very augustness of the task keeps us motivated and involved. When one gets stopped, just let me know.
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay. Yeah. All right.
It's not your good time.
Okay. All right. Okay. Fine. I'll adhere to that. All right. In the historical and hagiographical narrative that Judaism has initiated, which has been accepted by and large by both Christianity and Islam, the patriarch Abraham is the discoverer of the monotheistic principle that there is one infinite being whom we call God, who is the creator and governor of the universe. The way the ancient rabbis present it, and the way Maimonides describes it in his code, revelation is not the pivot of Abraham's discovery, but rather his coming up with the idea of God as a matter of theoretical investigation. From sociological and historical perspectives, as well as logical ones, monotheistic religion, with negative theology as its most cogent exegetical decoder, needs to be viewed as a secularist, skeptical response to the primitive animistic religion being practiced in the cultures in which monotheism emerged. Monotheism seeks to discredit the immanentist deities affirmed by animistic religion. It counterposes to them a single transcendent deity, both creating and governs the world. This deity, in his aloofness and loftiness, can appropriately be viewed as flagging the limitations of human reason with regard to the search for ultimate explanations, rather than as a cognitively accessible and substantively recognizable and identifiable God. In other words, the most logically sustainable way to view the role of God from a monotheistic Abrahamic perspective is negatively. He's there to block the attempt to invoke him as the direct factor responsible for anything. In other words, that he is that factor, but he is that factor only mystically and in humanly incomprehensible ways. But in terms of our development of even the most sophisticated logics and mathematics and theoretical physics and all of that, and these people work with super sophisticated tools, it's all going to be metaphor in relation to God. So what it's doing is that it blocks a divinization of our most sophisticated achievements. It keeps them all relative and fluid. It keeps us negative theological. So that God's there in the background. He's even a daily counterplayer if you pray. But as a daily counterplayer, he never sort of, comes down from the level of metaphor. He's our counterplayer as the metaphoric object of worship, as an entity that we can't directly know. We can't directly attribute anything to him. If you want to literalize the infinite God, you're turning him into a species of idolatry. In other words, the way to view him with proper circumspection, proper negative theological reverence and distance, is that he's blocking our attempts to divinize our own achievements. He keeps them fluid and in motion because we can never impute them to God. We have to realize these are only partial, imperfect, provisional human efforts. They never manage to overtake the character of God. They never receive direct literal divine sanction. Nothing that we ever do, all of our descriptions of God, philosophical investigations of the concept, all of the most sophisticated work of impossible worlds and mathematics and logics that relate to that, all of that is metaphoric. These are metaphoric adventures into something that God cannot, as a matter of negative theological faith, ever ratify, ever support as opening a window on who he is. Nothing opens a window on who he is. Our efforts only open windows on our own further efforts, and they don't connect with God. Nothing that we do connects with God. It's all on the level of metaphor. We have to preserve the infinity, the infinite distance, as a guarantee that we're still praying and relating to God. The emphasizing God's infinity is our most secure hedge for remaining authentic monotheistic believers. And the only kinds of human beings who can survive this severe and rigorous test of our mettle as human beings are those who manage to cultivate a secure, relatively secure, and expanding niche in the metaphysical middle. Those of us who adjust to that, who try to go into that role and grow in that role, are the ones who I think remain most faithful to the mandate of negative theology as the major decoder of monotheistic religion.